The card had already been declined twice, and the woman standing at the register could feel every eye in the line behind her burning into her back. Sarah Ellis pressed her thumb against the chip reader one more time, as if the machine could somehow be persuaded by force of will. The baby in the cart let out a thin, tired cry, and the cashier, a teenager with tired eyes, said the same words for the third time: "Card not approved." Sarah's face went hot. She had $11 in her account, and a cart with formula, bread, and a small bag of rice. She had done the math twice at home. She had been wrong. Behind her, a tall man in a work jacket shifted his weight and glanced at the register light blinking red. He was not in a hurry, though he looked like a man who rarely was not in a hurry. Daniel Hart had come in only for milk and tape for his daughter's science project, and he had been standing there long enough to hear the whole exchange without meaning to eavesdrop. He saw the way the young mother's shoulders curled inward, the way she kept her eyes down, the way her hand trembled slightly over the cart handle. He recognized that particular kind of exhaustion, the kind that came from doing everything right and still ending up short. He stepped forward before he had fully decided to. "Let me get this one," he said quietly, sliding his card toward the cashier before Sarah could protest. "I remember what it's like buying diapers at midnight prices." Sarah turned to him, startled, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of relief and humiliation. "No, please, I can put some things back," she said quickly, already reaching for the rice. "It's fine," he said, and there was nothing in his voice that suggested pity, only simple ease, as though he were commenting on the weather. The cashier, sensing the moment, rang up the total without further comment. Daniel signed the small receipt, nodded once, and picked up his own basket. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice catching. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "That's usually why people do things." She laughed, despite herself, a short, surprised sound, and for a moment the tension in her shoulders eased. The baby, sensing the shift, quieted in his seat. Daniel gave a small wave and walked toward the exit, and Sarah watched him go, unsure why the interaction had rattled her more than the declined card had. Outside, rain had begun to fall in a fine, cold mist, the kind that soaked through clothes without ever announcing itself as a real storm. Daniel jogged to his truck, tossed his bag onto the passenger seat, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. He thought of his daughter Lily, waiting at his sister's house, probably already deep into her science project, probably already annoyed that he had taken so long. He thought, briefly, of the young mother and her baby, and felt a small, familiar ache, the one that came whenever he saw someone carrying a weight he understood too well. Then he put the truck in gear and drove home, and by the time he reached his sister's porch, the moment at the store had already begun to fade into the ordinary noise of his day. He did not know it yet, but the moment was not over. It was only beginning. 3 days later, Daniel stood in the laundromat 2 blocks from his apartment, feeding quarters into a machine that had a habit of eating coins without turning on. Lily sat on a plastic chair nearby, swinging her legs and reading a book about volcanoes, occasionally looking up to ask him questions he could not always answer. The laundromat was warm and smelled of detergent, and the hum of dryers filled the silence between them. The door opened, and a stroller was pushed through backward, followed by a woman struggling to keep an umbrella from folding in on itself. Daniel looked up out of simple habit and felt a small jolt of recognition. It was her, the young mother from the grocery store, her hair damp, her son fussing quietly in the stroller. Sarah saw him at nearly the same moment, and her eyes widened slightly before her expression settled into something more careful. "Small world," she said, attempting a light tone. "Guess so," Daniel said, offering a small smile. "Rough morning?" She let out a breath. "Machine at my apartment building broke again. 3rd time this month." She glanced at the row of machines, then at her wallet, and something in her posture tightened again, the same careful bracing he had noticed at the store. He watched her feed bills into the change machine, watched the machine reject one bill after another, each rejection making her movements a little quicker, a little more tense. Without drawing attention to it, Daniel walked over and inserted a bill of his own, and the machine accepted it without hesitation. "Here," he said, handing her the resulting coins. "This machine likes me for some reason." Sarah stared at the coins in her palm, then at him. "You keep showing up when I'm having a bad day," she said, half laughing, half something else, something more careful. "Small neighborhood," he said simply. "People run into each other." She nodded, though something behind her eyes seemed to be turning over a thought she did not share. "Thank you," she said again, and this time her voice was steadier, though her gaze lingered on him a moment longer than the situation required. Lily, glancing up from her book, studied the baby in the stroller with open curiosity. "He's small," she announced. "He's 4 months old," Sarah said, smiling at the girl. "What's your book about?"
Volcanoes.
Lily said. "Did you know lava can be over 1,000 degrees?" "I did not know that," Sarah said, crouching slightly to look at the illustration Lily held up. "That's very hot." Daniel watched the small exchange with a quiet warmth he did not examine too closely. Around them, the dryers spun, and the rain outside slowed to a drizzle, and for a few minutes, the laundromat felt less like a place of small frustrations and more like an accidental pause in two lives that had, for reasons neither of them yet understood, begun to circle one another. When his clothes finished drying, Daniel folded them into a basket and gathered Lily's things. "Good luck with the machine," he said to Sarah as he headed for the door. "Good luck with the volcano project," she replied, and there was something warmer in her voice now, something that had not been there when she first walked in. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely, leaving the sidewalks slick and reflecting the gray afternoon sky. Daniel loaded the basket into his truck and buckled Lily into her seat, and as he pulled away from the curb, he found himself thinking, not for the first time, about coincidence, and how strange it was that certain people seemed to reappear in a life just when a person had begun to forget them. He told himself it meant nothing beyond the ordinary rhythms of a small neighborhood, and mostly he believed it. He did not know that Sarah, watching his truck disappear down the street, was thinking something far more complicated, something she had not yet found the courage to admit, even to herself. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed with her volcano book tucked under her pillow, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone lukewarm and his laptop open to a spreadsheet of bills he had been avoiding all week. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling into the night. He thought about his wife sometimes in moments like this, in the stillness after Lily was asleep, when the ordinary business of the day gave way to memory. It had been 3 years since he lost her, 3 years of learning how to braid hair badly and pack lunches on time, and answer questions about volcanoes he did not know the answers to. He had gotten better at it, mostly. Some nights were still harder than others. He thought, unexpectedly, of the young mother from the store and the laundromat, of the tired set of her shoulders, and the way she had thanked him twice, as though once was not enough to cover the debt she felt she owed. He wondered what her story was, what had brought her to a life of counting coins and bracing for machines to fail her. He told himself it was simple curiosity, the kind any decent person might feel toward a stranger in a hard patch, and he closed the laptop and went to check on Lily before turning in himself. Across town, in a small apartment with a broken washing machine down the hall and a baby finally asleep in his crib, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed with her phone in her hand, scrolling through a message thread she had read a dozen times already that week. The messages were from an old coworker named Meg, someone she had known before everything in her life had changed, before she had packed a single bag and left in the middle of the night with her son and nothing else. Meg had grown up 2 streets over from a man named Daniel Hart, and in an offhand conversation weeks earlier, over coffee Sarah could barely afford, Meg had mentioned him. A good man, Meg had said, raising his daughter alone since his wife passed. Kind to everyone, never asks for anything back, the kind of man you don't find twice. Sarah had laughed it off at the time, saying she had no interest in men, kind or otherwise, not after everything she had been through. But the words had stayed with her in a way she had not expected, tucked into the back of her mind like a splinter she could not quite locate. She told herself the encounters at the store and the laundromat were nothing more than the strange small coincidences of a neighborhood not large enough to keep people apart. She told herself this firmly, more than once, the way a person repeats a fact they are not entirely sure they believe. Still, as she set her phone down and turned off the lamp, she found herself thinking of his voice, steady and unbothered, and the way he had looked at her without a trace of pity, only plain and simple kindness. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit, and long after the apartment had gone dark and quiet, she lay awake turning the thought over, wondering what kind of man gave so easily and expected nothing at all in return, and whether such a man could possibly be real. The following Saturday brought a bright, clean sky, the kind that made the whole city look freshly washed, and Daniel took Lily to the park near the community center, the one with the tall slide she loved and the swings that squeaked no matter how much oil the maintenance crew poured on them. He sat on a bench with a paperback he rarely had time to finish, glancing up every few pages to watch Lily race across the play structure with 2 other children from her class. He noticed the stroller before he noticed the woman pushing it, tucked beside a bench on the far side of the play area, one wheel visibly flat and useless against the pavement. Sarah crouched beside it, her son balanced on one hip, trying to work the wheel free with her free hand while balancing a diaper bag that kept sliding off her shoulder. Daniel watched for a moment, telling himself it was not his business, that a person could not spend a lifetime rescuing every stranger who crossed his path. But something about the particular exhaustion in her posture, the same exhaustion he had seen twice before, pulled him up off the bench before he had finished the thought. "Need a hand?" he asked, crouching beside the stroller. Sarah looked up, startled, and for a brief moment something flickered across her face that was not quite surprise, something closer to recognition of a pattern she herself had not fully named. "Oh," she said, "it's you again. Seems to be a habit of mine," he said, examining the wheel. "This axle's bent. You're not getting this back on without tools. I don't suppose you carry a toolbox around for random park emergencies," she said, attempting lightness though her voice carried a thread of genuine frustration. "As a matter of fact," he said, nodding toward the parking lot, "I might. Wait here." He jogged to his truck, returned with a small kit from behind the driver's seat, and knelt beside the stroller, working the wheel loose and straightening the bent axle, with a practiced patience that came from years of fixing things that broke on job sites. Lily wandered over at some point, curious, and struck up an easy conversation with Sarah's son, who was now old enough to sit upright and grab at things with delighted, clumsy hands. Sarah watched Daniel work, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said quietly, once the wheel clicked back into place. "I know," he said, echoing his words from the grocery store without seeming to notice the repetition. "But it's fixed now, so." She almost laughed, though something behind her eyes remained careful, watchful, as though she were reading a book whose ending she suspected but had not yet confirmed. "Thank you," she said, for the 3rd time in as many weeks, and this time the words carried a weight that surprised even her. That evening, Daniel stopped by his sister's house to pick up a casserole dish she had borrowed and never returned, and Lily ran off immediately to play with her cousins, while the adults sat in the kitchen. Grace Hart, 4 years older than her brother and twice as observant, poured 2 glasses of iced tea and studied him with the particular expression she reserved for moments when she suspected there was more to a story than she was being told. "You've got that look again," she said. "What look?" Daniel said, though he knew exactly what she meant. "The look you get when something's rattling around in your head that you haven't figured out how to say yet," she said. "Spill it." He told her, somewhat reluctantly, about the grocery store, the laundromat, and now the park, the strange repetition of running into the same young mother at exactly the moments she needed help. Grace listened with growing amusement, her eyebrows climbing higher with each retelling. "Daniel," she said finally, "that is not a coincidence. That is a woman finding excuses to be near you." "That's ridiculous," he said. "It's a small neighborhood. It's a big enough neighborhood that you don't run into the same stranger 3 times in 3 weeks, unless one of you is arranging it," Grace said. "And you've never exactly been a hard man to spot. Big truck, kid in tow, obviously the type who'll stop and help a stranger. If someone wanted to find you, it wouldn't take much work." Daniel frowned into his glass, turning the idea over uncomfortably. He did not like the implication, not because it offended him, but because it complicated something that had, until now, felt simple and easy to understand. He preferred a version of events in which he had simply been decent to a stranger in need, 3 separate times, out of nothing more than ordinary human kindness. The idea that there might be intention behind it, calculation even, sat uneasily in his chest. "Even if that's true," he said slowly, So what? Maybe she needs help and doesn't know how to ask for it directly. Maybe there's a reason she can't just walk up and say it plainly. Grace studied him for a long moment. Then her expression softened. Or maybe, she said, you're a good man and she noticed. And she's scared. And this is the clumsy way people do things when they don't trust the world to be kind to them without a test first. Daniel did not answer right away. He thought of the way Sarah had held herself at the store, the laundromat, the park, always a little apart, always bracing as though for a blow that never came. He thought of the way her shoulders eased, just slightly, each time he offered help without asking anything of her in return. If Grace was right, if there was some deliberate pattern behind their meetings, he found that it did not make him angry. If anything, it made him want to understand why a person would need to test kindness before trusting it. What history had taught her that trust could not simply be given, only proven. I don't know, he said finally. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, or maybe you are. Grace smiled, the particular knowing smile of an older sister who had been right about her brother's life more times than either of them cared to count. Just be careful, she said. Not because I think she means you harm, because you've got a soft heart, and soft hearts get taken advantage of by people who aren't kind, even if this one turns out to be exactly what she seems. He drove home that night with Lily asleep in the back seat, her head tilted against the window, and found himself replaying every encounter with new eyes. He thought of the exact timing of each meeting, how each time Sarah had appeared to be in genuine, unmistakable difficulty that could not easily be staged. A declined card, a broken machine, a bent axle. He told himself that even if Grace was right about intention, the difficulties themselves had been real. Whatever Sarah's reasons, she was not inventing hardship. She was, at most, choosing when and where to let him see it. The thought unsettled him less than he expected. If anything, it made him curious about the woman behind the careful, guarded exterior, the one who thanked him 3 times for kindnesses she clearly believed she did not deserve. Between the park and the pharmacy, there was one more meeting Daniel would later remember clearly, though at the time it registered only as a pleasant surprise, rather than another link in a chain he had not yet fully recognized. It happened at the public library on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, where he had taken Lily after school to return a stack of overdue picture books and pick up a title she needed for a class assignment on ocean animals. The children's section was nearly empty, apart from a librarian reshelving returns, and a young mother settled into one of the low reading chairs with a picture book open across her lap, her son propped against her side, listening intently, despite being far too young to understand most of the words. Sarah looked up when Lily's laughter carried across the quiet room, and for a moment neither of them spoke, simply exchanging a look that had begun, by now, to feel almost like an old joke between them, the universe apparently determined to keep placing them within sight of one another. We have to stop meeting like this, Sarah said lightly, closing the picture book as Noah reached for the cover with grabby, curious hands. People will start to talk, Daniel agreed, settling into the chair across from her, while Lily wandered off to browse the ocean animal section with the librarian's help. They talked for nearly an hour that afternoon, an easy, unhurried conversation that ranged from the merits of various children's authors to the ongoing renovation happening 2 streets over from both of their apartments. Small, ordinary talk that nonetheless left Daniel walking out into the rain afterward feeling lighter than he had in some time, and Sarah watching him go with an expression that, had he turned back to catch it, might have told him more than any of their conversation had. 2 days later, at the small pharmacy near his apartment, he saw her again, this time standing at the counter, with a prescription for her son's ear infection, and a wallet that came up short by a few dollars after the insurance discount failed to apply correctly. Daniel, who had come in only for aspirin, watched the pharmacist explain the pricing error, watched Sarah's expression tighten into the same careful mask he now recognized, and before she could turn to leave the medicine behind, he stepped up and covered the difference without a word of explanation, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Sarah turned to him, and this time there was no surprise at all in her expression, only something raw and unguarded, something that looked almost like relief, mixed with something heavier, something closer to shame. "You don't have to keep finding me," she said quietly, once they had stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, her son's medicine tucked safely into her bag. "I'm not finding you," he said gently. You keep finding me." She was quiet for a long moment, studying the pavement, her jaw working as though she were deciding whether to say something important. In the end, she said only, "I know. I'm sorry, it's complicated." "I've got time," he said, and there was no judgment in his voice, only patience, the kind that came easily to a man who had spent years learning to wait out a child's slow-building explanations without rushing them. "Not today," she said, and though her voice cracked slightly, she managed a small, grateful smile before turning to walk toward the bus stop, her son balanced on her hip, leaving Daniel standing on the sidewalk with more questions than he had carried into the pharmacy, and a growing certainty that whatever Sarah's reasons were, he wanted to understand them before he let this go any further. That night, after Lily had gone to sleep, Daniel sat on his porch step with a cup of coffee cooling in his hands, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one, and allowed himself, for the first time, to consider the possibility that Grace was right. Somewhere across town a woman was watching him, weighing him, deciding whether he was the kind of man his reputation suggested, or merely another disappointment waiting to happen. He found, to his own surprise, that he did not resent the idea. He understood, in some quiet, unspoken part of himself, exactly what it meant to need proof before you trusted anyone with the fragile, essential things in your life. He had needed that once too, after losing his wife, when every kindness from well-meaning neighbors had felt like a transaction he could not afford to accept. He decided, sitting there in the dark, that if Sarah needed time and careful testing before she trusted him, he would give her both, without complaint, without demanding an explanation before she was ready to offer one. He did not yet know how close he was to learning the truth, or how much that truth would test the patience he had just promised himself he would offer freely. Meanwhile, in her apartment across town, Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, while her son played with a set of soft blocks nearby, her phone pressed to her ear, as she spoke to Meg in the low, hurried voice of someone who did not want to be overheard, even though there was no one else in the room to hear. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," she said. "It started as one thing, checking if he was really as decent as you said, and now it's turned into something else, and I don't know how to stop it without looking exactly like what I am." "And what is that?" Meg asked, her voice crackling faintly through the line. "Someone who's been lying to a good man for a month," Sarah said, dropping her head into her free hand. "Every time I run into him, it looks like an accident, but it isn't. I looked up his work schedule from something you mentioned once. I know which grocery store he stops at after his shift. I know which park his daughter likes. I didn't plan the flat tire. That part was real. But I knew where to be when it happened, and that's not nothing, Meg. That's not an accident. That's something else entirely." Meg was quiet for a moment before she spoke again, her tone gentler now. "Sarah," she said, "can I ask you something? And I want you to actually think about it before you answer. After everything that happened with your ex, after everything he did and didn't do you think it's unreasonable that you needed to see for yourself, more than once, before you let another man matter to you?" Sarah closed her eyes, remembering nights she preferred not to remember, promises broken so many times that she had stopped believing promises meant anything at all. She thought of the fear that had driven her out of that life in the middle of the night with nothing but a bag and her son, the fear that had followed her since, whispering that kindness was always temporary, that men who seemed decent in the beginning eventually showed their true faces once they had nothing left to prove. "No," she admitted quietly. "I don't think it's unreasonable, but it doesn't make it fair to him. He's not the man who hurt me. He hasn't done anything except be exactly as kind as you said he'd be, every single time, without asking for anything back. And I keep testing him anyway because some part of me still doesn't believe that's possible without a catch." "Then maybe," Meg said carefully, "the real question isn't whether it's fair to keep testing him. Maybe it's how much longer you're going to need to, before you trust what you're already seeing with your own eyes." Sarah did not have an answer for that, not yet. And after a while the conversation drifted to smaller things, the baby's ear infection clearing up, Meg's own troubles at work, ordinary talk that filled the space where harder truths sat unresolved. But long after she had hung up the phone and tucked her son into his crib for the night, Sarah lay awake, turning Meg's question over in her mind, aware that the answer was approaching faster than she was ready for, and that soon there would be no way to keep the truth hidden behind the comfortable excuse of coincidence. The following week brought one final test, though Sarah would later admit to herself that she had not fully planned this one, that circumstance and her own tangled intentions had simply collided at the worst possible moment. Her car, an old sedan that had given her trouble for months, finally refused to start in the parking lot of her son's pediatrician's office, the engine turning over with a dull, useless click that told her exactly nothing was going to happen no matter how many times she tried. She sat there for a long moment with her hands on the wheel, her son fussing in his car seat behind her, and felt something close to despair settle over her, heavier than it had any right to be over something as small as a dead battery. She thought of calling Daniel and hated herself a little for how quickly the thought arrived, how automatic it had become to imagine his steady presence solving whatever problem stood in front of her. She did not call him. Instead, she called a tow service she could not really afford, and sat in the parking lot with the windows cracked for air, trying to soothe her son while she waited, feeling for the first time in weeks, entirely and honestly alone, without any arrangement, without any test, simply a woman, with a dead car, and a fussy baby, and no one to call who would not cost her more than she had. It was, strangely, the realest moment she had experienced in the entire month of careful, deliberate coincidences, and it left her with an uncomfortable clarity. She had spent weeks engineering opportunities to see whether Daniel Hart's kindness was genuine, and now, in the one moment she had not arranged at all, he was nowhere near, and she understood with sudden, sharp certainty that she wanted him to be. Not because she needed rescuing, but because somewhere in the last month, without her fully realizing it, she had stopped merely testing him and started simply wanting him near. The tow truck arrived 40 minutes later, and by the time she made it home, exhausted and rattled, she had made a decision. Whatever the truth cost her, whatever it revealed about the small deceptions she had allowed herself over the past weeks, she owed Daniel Hart an honest account of what had really been happening every time their paths had crossed. She did not know yet how she would find the courage to say it, only that the alternative, continuing to let him believe in a version of events that was not entirely true, had become impossible to carry any further. The following Sunday, Daniel found himself standing outside the pediatrician's office building, not because he had planned to be there, but because Lily had a checkup scheduled for her allergy medication, and the appointment happened to fall an hour after Sarah's own visit had ended 2 days earlier, a detail he did not yet know. He was sitting in the waiting room, half listening to Lily recount a story about her friend's new puppy, when Sarah walked in with her son balanced on her hip, arriving for a follow-up appointment about the ear infection that had finally begun to clear. She stopped short when she saw him, and for the first time since the grocery store, neither of them pretended surprise. There was something almost comfortable in the shared recognition of coincidence continuing to knit their lives together, whether either of them fully understood why. "You again?" she said, taking the seat beside him without waiting for an invitation, an easy familiarity that had not existed a month earlier. "Me again," he agreed, and for the next 20 minutes, while Lily colored quietly on a clipboard the receptionist had given her and Sarah's son gummed contentedly on a soft toy, the two adults talked in the unhurried way of people who had run out of reasons to keep a polite distance from each other. He learned that her son was named Noah, that he had been born during a difficult winter that Sarah did not elaborate on beyond a brief mention of hard months, and that she worked part-time doing invoice data for a small logistics company, a job that let her keep flexible hours but paid barely enough to cover the essentials. She learned in turn that Daniel worked as a foreman at a construction supply yard, that Lily had been 3 years old when her mother passed from a sudden illness that had moved faster than any of the doctors expected, and that he had spent the years since learning, mostly through trial and error, how to be both parents at once. "I still don't know how to do the hair thing properly," he admitted, gesturing vaguely toward Lily's slightly uneven braids. "She's very patient with me about it." "It's a good braid," Sarah said, glancing over at Lily with genuine warmth. "Better than some I've seen from parents who've had years more practice." Before either appointment concluded, Lily wandered over from her coloring clipboard and asked Sarah, with the effortless curiosity of a child unbothered by adult formality, whether Noah liked volcanoes too. Sarah laughed and admitted that Noah was mostly interested in chewing on whatever was nearest to hand, which included, on more than one occasion, an actual library book about volcanoes that she had apologized for profusely and eventually paid to replace. Lily found this endlessly funny, and for the remainder of the wait, She took it upon herself to explain, in great and occasionally inaccurate detail, exactly which parts of a volcano were safe to chew on and which were not. An explanation Daniel and Sarah both listened to, with barely contained amusement, exchanging glances over the children's heads that carried more warmth than either of them had yet found words for. By the time both appointments concluded, an unspoken agreement seemed to have settled over them that this would not be the last time they sought each other out on purpose, rather than waiting for chance to arrange it. Daniel suggested, somewhat awkwardly, that the children might enjoy a trip to the small zoo on the edge of town the following weekend, and Sarah, after only a brief hesitation, agreed. That Saturday became the first of several outings that followed in quick succession over the next few weeks. They took the children to the zoo, where Lily and Noah, despite the difference in their ages, developed an easy fondness for each other, Lily delighting in showing the baby every animal, as though she had personally arranged for them all to be there. They met for lunch at a small diner near the park, where Daniel discovered that Sarah had a talent for making even the most exhausting stories about broken appliances and unreliable buses sound funny in the retelling, a skill that made him laugh more in a single afternoon than he had in months. Slowly, carefully, they began to trade the larger pieces of their histories, the parts that took more courage to hand over than casual details about jobs and children. Daniel told her about the last conversation he'd had with his wife before the hospital, how neither of them had known it would be the last real conversation, how for a long time afterward he had been afraid that loving anyone again would mean risking that particular kind of loss twice. Sarah listened without offering easy comfort, only quiet attention, the kind that made him feel heard rather than managed. In turn, though it took her longer, and though she chose her words with visible care, Sarah began to share pieces of what had brought her to this point in her life, a relationship that had started well enough, and slowly turned into something she had needed years to recognize as unsafe for herself, and for Noah, a departure made in a single night, with nothing but a packed bag, and a plan she had barely had time to finish forming. She did not go into every detail, and Daniel did not ask for them, understanding instinctively that some doors needed to be opened slowly, at a pace the person holding the key alone could decide. "I spent a long time not trusting my own judgment after that," she admitted one evening, as they sat on a bench outside the diner, while the children played nearby under the fading orange light of a summer evening. "I got it wrong once, badly wrong, and it cost me things I'm still trying to get back. So now I'm careful, maybe too careful." "Careful isn't a bad thing," Daniel said. "It just means you learned something the hard way. Nothing wrong with a person protecting themselves after that." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, and Daniel found himself wondering, not for the first time, what exactly that careful watchfulness had cost her to maintain, and how much of the past month's small coincidences had been born from precisely that instinct to protect herself before allowing anyone close. He did not push the thought further, choosing instead to let the evening settle into the comfortable quiet that had become familiar between them. One warm evening in the middle of that stretch of weeks, Daniel invited Sarah and Noah to join him and Lily for a small cookout in the shared yard behind his apartment building. Nothing elaborate, just burgers on a second-hand grill and a folding table borrowed from Grace. Grace herself showed up uninvited, claiming she had simply come to retrieve the folding table, though everyone at the gathering understood perfectly well that she had come to see this woman her brother had been talking about with an increasing and, for him, uncharacteristic frequency. Grace studied Sarah with open curiosity throughout the evening, asking careful questions disguised as small talk, and by the time the sun had dropped low enough to paint the yard in soft orange light, she had apparently decided something in Sarah's favor, because she pulled Daniel aside near the grill and murmured, quietly enough that only he could hear, that she liked her, that whatever complicated thing had brought the two of them together, it looked like something worth allowing to continue. Later, after Grace had gone home and the children had tired themselves out chasing a moth around the porch light, Daniel and Sarah sat together on the porch steps, while Lily and Noah dozed against their respective parents, full and sleepy from the long evening outdoors. Sarah rested her head briefly against Daniel's shoulder, an unplanned, unguarded gesture that surprised them both, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, content simply to sit in the warm hush of the settling evening. "I haven't let myself feel this easy around anyone in a long time," Sarah admitted quietly, her voice soft with something like wonder. It scares me a little, how easy it's become. Easy isn't something to be scared of, Daniel said gently, though he understood, even as he said it, that ease built on an incomplete foundation carried its own quiet risks, risks neither of them had yet spoken aloud. Sarah did not answer right away, and in the silence that followed, Daniel found himself wondering again about the odd, persistent thread of coincidence that had first brought them together. A thread he had mostly set aside in the warmth of the weeks that followed, but which now, in this quiet, unguarded moment, tugged faintly at the edge of his attention, refusing entirely to be forgotten. As the weeks passed, Lily began asking, with the blunt honesty only children seem to possess, whether Sarah and Noah would be joining them for dinner again soon, whether Noah could come to her school program, whether they might all go to the lake together before summer ended. Daniel found himself smiling at these questions more often than he corrected them, aware that his daughter had noticed something shifting in their household long before he had allowed himself to name it directly. One evening, after the children had been put down for the night at Daniel's apartment, where Sarah had stayed later than usual helping clean up after a dinner that had somehow expanded to include an entire lasagna and 3 kinds of dessert, the two of them sat on the small back porch, with mugs of tea cooling between them, the city noise reduced to a distant hum beyond the fence line. "I keep thinking about something Grace said," Daniel admitted, after a long, comfortable silence, and Sarah tilted her head, curious. "She said it wasn't exactly a coincidence. All those times we kept running into each other. She thought maybe you were finding excuses to be near me." Sarah went very still, her hands tightening slightly around her mug, and for a moment, Daniel worried he had pushed too far, too soon, breaking whatever fragile trust had built between them over the past weeks. "What do you think about that?" she asked carefully, her voice quieter than before. "I think," he said slowly, choosing his words with the same deliberate care he used when explaining difficult things to Lily, "that if it's true, I understand it. I think if someone's been hurt badly enough, sometimes you need more than words before you believe someone means what they say. I don't think there's anything wrong with needing proof. I just want to know, if that's what's been happening, that I'm not misunderstanding something important between us." Sarah set her mug down carefully on the small table between them, her hands trembling slightly, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, staring out into the dark yard, as though gathering courage from somewhere just beyond the reach of the porch light. "There's something I need to tell you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "and I'm afraid that once I do, you're going to look at everything differently, and I don't know if I'll be able to fix that after it's said." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear exactly, but a kind of bracing, the sensation of standing at the edge of a conversation that would change the shape of everything that came after it. He reached over, not quite touching her hand, leaving the choice to close that distance entirely hers. "Whatever it is," he said quietly, "I'd rather hear it from you than keep guessing at it. I think we've both had enough of guessing." Sarah nodded slowly, drawing in a long, unsteady breath, and though the words did not come easily, though she stumbled over the first few attempts before finding a place to properly begin, she finally started to speak, and Daniel listened, bracing himself for whatever truth she had been carrying since the very first day their paths had crossed at that grocery store checkout. Weeks that now felt impossibly distant from the two people sitting quietly together on this small back porch, waiting to find out whether what they had built together could survive the honesty about how it had actually begun. "It started with Meg," Sarah said, her voice unsteady but determined to push through despite the tremor in it. "A few months ago, before any of this, she mentioned you to me, told me who you were, what kind of man people said you were. Kind, steady, raising your daughter alone, and never once complaining about it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I told her I wasn't interested in men, not after everything with Noah's father, and I meant it." Daniel said nothing, watching her carefully, his expression unreadable in the dim porch light, and Sarah forced herself to continue, aware that stopping now would only make finishing this confession harder later. "But the idea stayed with me anyway," she said, "and somewhere along the way, without fully admitting it to myself, I started paying attention to little things Meg mentioned about your schedule, which store you stopped at after work, which park your daughter liked. I told myself I was just curious. I told myself it didn't mean anything. And then that day at the grocery store, when my card got declined, I want you to know that part was completely real. I wasn't lying about being broke, about being desperate that week, but I chose that store on purpose that evening, because some small, dishonest part of me wondered if you'd actually be the kind of man Meg described, or if the story had been exaggerated the way stories about good people sometimes are. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, though he kept his voice even. And the laundromat, he said. The park. The pharmacy. All real problems, she said quickly, her voice cracking. The machine really was broken. The stroller wheel really was bent. Noah's medicine really did cost more than I had. I never invented a single hardship, Daniel. I promise you that much is true. But I knew where you'd likely be, more or less, because of things Meg had mentioned, and I let those real problems happen to intersect with your schedule instead of simply asking for help outright, or simply telling you honestly that I wanted to get to know you. I told myself each time that it was the last time, that I wouldn't do it again, and then I would, because some part of me needed to see, over and over, whether your kindness held up without an audience, without anything obvious to gain from it. The porch fell into a silence so complete that even the distant hum of the city seemed to soften around them. Daniel sat very still, processing the shape of what she had told him, turning over each remembered moment, the grocery store, the laundromat, the park, the pharmacy, searching them now for evidence of manipulation, and finding, to his own quiet relief, that the hardships themselves had never once been false. What had been arranged was only the timing, only the proximity, and even that, he understood slowly, had been born not from calculation meant to take advantage of him, but from a fear so deep it had needed proof before it could risk hoping for anything better. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he asked finally, his voice quiet, not unkind, but carrying a weight of genuine hurt he did not try to hide. Any of those times. You could have just said, "I'd like to get to know you." I would have said yes. "I know," Sarah said, tears finally slipping free, her voice thick with them. "I know that now." But saying it plainly meant risking rejection the ordinary way, the way that leaves you with no proof either way, no evidence to hold on to if it went wrong. Testing you quietly felt safer, because if you failed, I could tell myself it never really counted, that it was just circumstance, and I could protect the part of myself that still believed good men existed somewhere, even if you turned out not to be one of them. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand across his face, feeling the mixture of hurt and understanding tangle together in a way that made it difficult to know which to speak to first. He thought of Grace's words weeks earlier, the casual observation that had planted this very possibility in his mind, long before Sarah had found the courage to confirm it herself. He thought of the version of himself that existed 3 years ago, freshly widowed, flinching away from every well-meaning gesture from neighbors and coworkers because accepting kindness had felt, in that raw grief, like agreeing to owe someone something he could not afford to give back. He understood, more than he wanted to admit in this moment of hurt, exactly what kind of fear made a person need proof before trust, because he had lived inside that fear himself, in his own way, for longer than he liked to remember. Still, understanding the reason did not immediately erase the sting of realizing that weeks of what he had believed to be simple, uncomplicated fate had, in fact, been partly engineered, that Sarah had known things about his life and movements that he had not knowingly shared with her, that she had walked into their earliest meetings already carrying more information than he had ever suspected. He needed, he realized, a moment to sit with that discomfort honestly, rather than rushing to reassure her simply because her tears made the silence hard to bear. "I need to think," he said finally, and he watched her face fall at the words, watched her brace, as though she had expected exactly this response, and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. "I'm not saying it's over," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "I'm saying I need to actually sit with this honestly, instead of just telling you what you want to hear right now because you're upset. You deserve better than a quick answer I haven't actually thought through, and so do I." Sarah nodded slowly, wiping at her face with the back of her hand, and though disappointment shadowed her features, there was also, buried beneath it, a flicker of something like relief, as though his honesty, even in this uncomfortable moment, confirmed something she had needed confirmed all along. "That's fair," she said quietly. "That's more than fair." Daniel gathered Lily gently into his arms, the girl barely stirring as he lifted her, and walked Sarah and Noah to her car in a silence that was not unkind but carried the particular heaviness of two people, uncertain what came next. He did not offer false comfort at the car door, and she did not ask for it, both of them understanding that anything said too quickly now would only cheapen whatever honest answer eventually followed. "Good night, Daniel," she said softly, settling Noah into his car seat. "Good night," he replied, and watched her taillights disappear around the corner before carrying Lily inside and laying her carefully in her bed, her small face peaceful in a way his own thoughts were decidedly not. He did not sleep well that night. He lay awake, replaying every encounter of the past month through this new, more complicated lens, searching for anger and finding, more often than not, only a tired, aching sympathy for a woman who had been so thoroughly failed by trust before that she had needed to build an elaborate, careful bridge before she could risk crossing toward someone new. He thought of his late wife, of the plain, unguarded way she had once trusted him completely, and felt a pang of something complicated, not quite guilt, not quite grief, but some blurred cousin of both, at the thought of building something new with a woman whose trust had been so thoroughly broken that she had needed proof extracted in secret rather than given freely. By the time morning light crept through his curtains, he had reached no firm conclusion, only a growing, uneasy certainty that whatever decision he made in the coming days would matter more than almost any decision he had made since the year his wife died, and that he owed it to both himself and to Sarah to get it right, rather than fast. He dropped Lily off at school that morning, distracted enough that he nearly forgot her lunch bag on the kitchen counter, and by mid-morning, unable to concentrate properly on the delivery schedules waiting on his desk at the supply yard, he called Grace and asked if she had time for coffee during her lunch break. She agreed at once, hearing something in his voice she recognized from years of watching her brother carry burdens quietly, rather than asking for help with them. They met at a small coffee shop near her office, and Daniel recounted the previous night's conversation in careful detail, watching his sister's face shift from surprise to thoughtful consideration as he spoke. When he finished, Grace was quiet for a long moment, turning her cup slowly on its saucer. "I told you it wasn't a coincidence," she said finally, though there was no triumph in her voice, only a kind of gentle acknowledgement. "I didn't expect to be right about quite this much of it, though." "I don't know what to do with it," Daniel admitted. "Part of me understands completely why she did it. I remember what it felt like after Claire died, how every kind word from someone felt like a debt I couldn't afford, how I flinched away from casseroles and check-ins because accepting them meant admitting how much I actually needed them. I get needing proof before you can let yourself hope for something. But another part of me keeps snagging on the fact that she knew things about my life she never told me she knew, that she walked toward me already carrying information I didn't realize I'd given her." Grace nodded slowly, considering this. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "If she'd walked up to you cold on any of those days, no crisis, no coincidence, just a woman saying she'd heard good things about you and wanted to get to know you, what would you have done?" Daniel thought about it honestly, turning the hypothetical over with the same care he applied to a load calculation at the yard, wanting to get it exactly right rather than simply convenient. Probably would have been flattered and awkward about it, he admitted eventually. Probably would have made some joke to cover how uncomfortable it made me, and probably wouldn't have followed up the way I did when it happened through those small moments of actually helping her. "So, in a strange way," Grace said carefully, "the method she chose, however complicated and imperfect, might have actually gotten you both further than the plain, ordinary approach would have. That doesn't make it right, exactly, but it doesn't make it nothing either. People who've been hurt badly don't always find the healthiest way to protect themselves first. Doesn't mean the fear underneath isn't real, or worth being patient with." Daniel sat with that for a long moment, watching the steam rise off his coffee, thinking of Lily's uneven braids and Noah's small delighted grin whenever Lily appeared, thinking of the quiet ease that had settled between himself and Sarah over these past weeks, an ease that had felt, until last night, like the simplest and most natural thing in his life since Claire had passed. He thought too of his own fear in those early months of grief, how readily he had wanted to believe the worst of people's motives, simply because trusting good intentions again had felt too dangerous to risk. "I think I need to talk to her again," he said finally, Properly this time, not to punish her for how it started, but to understand it, and to figure out honestly whether I can build something with someone who needed to test me before she trusted me, or whether that's going to sit between us every time things get hard later. Only you can answer that, Grace said gently. But for what it's worth, from everything you've told me, and from the one evening I spent watching the two of you together at that cookout, I don't think she was ever testing you to trap you into something. I think she was testing you to protect herself from being hurt again, and those are very different things, even if they look similar from the outside. Daniel left the coffee shop that afternoon with no less to think about, but with a clearer sense of the direction his thoughts needed to move. And as he drove back to the supply yard, he found himself composing and discarding several versions of what he wanted to say to Sarah the next time they spoke, none of them quite adequate to the size of what he was trying to convey. 2 days passed without contact between them. 2 days in which Sarah went about her ordinary routines with a hollow, anxious feeling lodged permanently beneath her ribs, checking her phone far more often than she cared to admit, bracing each time for either a message that never came or a silence that stretched a little longer than the last. Noah, oblivious to his mother's distraction, babbled happily through his afternoons, and Sarah found herself grateful for the small demands of caring for him, the way they forced her attention away from the anxious spiral her thoughts kept threatening to become. On the evening of the third day, her phone finally buzzed with a message from Daniel, brief and direct in the way all his messages tended to be. "Can we talk tonight?" it read. "I can bring dinner over if that's easier than finding a sitter." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, her heart pounding uncomfortably, before typing back a simple agreement, and spent the following hour tidying an apartment that did not particularly need tidying, a nervous habit she recognized in herself but could not quite stop. Daniel arrived a little after 7, carrying a bag of takeout from the diner, where they had shared so many earlier conversations, and Lily trailing behind him with a coloring book tucked under her arm, apparently under strict instructions to keep Noah entertained while the adults talked. Sarah let them in, her hands trembling slightly as she took the bag of food from him, searching his face for some early sign of what he had decided, finding only the same careful, thoughtful expression he had worn since the porch conversation 3 nights earlier. They settled the children at the small kitchen table with their coloring books, then moved to the living room, where Daniel set down the remaining food and sat across from her, rather than beside her, a small physical distance that felt, to Sarah, like a decision in itself, though she could not yet tell what kind. "I've spent 3 days thinking about this," he began, and Sarah folded her hands tightly in her lap, bracing herself. "I'm not going to pretend it didn't hurt. Finding out that some of what felt like fate to me was actually you finding ways to be where I'd be. I won't pretend that didn't sting, because it did, and I think it's fair that it did." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat, and Daniel continued, his voice steady despite the difficulty of what he was saying. "But I also spent 3 days remembering what it felt like after Claire died," he said. "How every kindness from someone felt like a debt I was terrified I couldn't repay. How I actively pushed away people who tried to help me because trusting that help meant admitting how badly I needed it, and how much it would hurt if it turned out not to be real. I understand needing proof before you can let yourself hope for something good. I understand it because I lived some version of that fear myself, just pointed in a slightly different direction." Sarah's eyes filled with tears she did not immediately try to hide, and Daniel reached across the small space between them, taking her hand gently, giving her the choice to pull away if she needed to. She did not pull away. "What I need you to understand," he said, "is that from here forward, I need you to tell me things instead of arranging for me to discover them. Not because I think you're planning to keep testing me forever, but because whatever we build together has to be built on the two of us actually talking to each other, especially about the hard things, especially when it would be easier to just let circumstance carry the weight instead. I can be patient with a lot, Sarah. I can't be patient with silence standing in for honesty forever." "That's fair," she said, her voice thick, wiping at her eyes with her free hand. "That's more than fair. I promise you, whatever comes next, I'll tell you, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Daniel studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression finally softened fully, the careful reserve of the past 3 days giving way to something warmer, more certain. "Then I think," he said quietly, "that we're exactly where we need to be. Not because everything's already solved, but because we're actually talking about it instead of guessing. Sarah let out a breath that seemed to carry 3 days of held tension with it, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, content simply to sit together in the quiet relief of having crossed through something difficult and found each other still standing on the other side of it. The weeks that followed unfolded with a new kind of ease, one built not on careful arrangement or hidden testing, but on plain, ordinary honesty, the kind that came from two people who had already survived the hardest conversation and found that trust, however fragile it had once seemed, could hold weight when both people chose, actively and repeatedly, to keep offering it honestly. Sarah told him things now instead of engineering situations to reveal them. Difficult days at work, worries about Noah's development, the occasional bill that still stretched her thin, and Daniel, in turn, found himself opening up in ways he had not managed with anyone since Claire, sharing small worries about Lily's schoolwork, about whether he was doing enough, about the occasional loneliness that still crept in on quiet nights. Grace, watching the two of them settle into an easy, unforced rhythm over the following months, remarked more than once that she had never seen her brother quite this relaxed, quite this willing to let someone else carry part of a burden he had spent years insisting on shouldering alone. Lily, for her part, declared with the simple confidence of an 8-year-old that Noah was basically her brother now, a statement she made so matter-of-factly at dinner one evening that neither adult quite knew how to respond beyond a shared, quietly amused glance across the table. By the time autumn arrived, Daniel and Sarah had settled into a routine that neither of them had planned so much as simply grown into. Dinners shared several nights a week, weekends spent together as a natural extension of an ordinary life, rather than a series of special occasions, the children's schedules folding into each other with an ease that suggested a family forming itself gradually, without fanfare, out of consistent small choices rather than any single dramatic decision. One evening in late autumn, as the four of them sat around Daniel's kitchen table finishing a meal that had become something of a weekly tradition, Lily looked up from her plate and asked, with her usual directness, whether Sarah and Noah would ever just live with them instead of visiting all the time. Sarah glanced at Daniel, uncertain how he wanted to handle the question, and Daniel, after a moment of consideration, simply smiled and said that it was something the grown-ups were still figuring out, though from the look that passed between him and Sarah in that moment, both of them understood that the answer had already been decided in every way that mattered, and that the practical details would follow in their own time. Later that night, after the children had been tucked into their beds and the kitchen had been cleared of the evening's dishes, Daniel and Sarah sat together on the same back porch where the truth had first been spoken weeks earlier, the same quiet yard, the same distant hum of the city beyond the fence line, though everything about the moment felt entirely changed from what it had been then. "I used to think I needed proof before I could trust anything good," Sarah said quietly, watching the last of the evening light fade from the sky. "I think what I actually needed was someone patient enough to let me learn a different way of trusting, one that didn't require tests at all." Daniel reached over and took her hand, the gesture familiar now, worn smooth by months of small repeated choices to remain close rather than guarded. "I think," he said, "we both needed exactly that kind of patience from each other. I don't think either of us could have gotten here any faster than we did." Sarah rested her head against his shoulder, the same gesture that had once surprised them both months earlier, though now it carried none of that earlier uncertainty, only the settled comfort of two people who had built something real, slowly and honestly, out of a beginning that had been complicated in ways neither of them could have predicted. Inside the apartment, Lily and Noah slept soundly, unaware of the quiet, steady thing taking shape around them, a family being built not out of a single sweeping moment, but out of 100 small choices to keep showing up, to keep telling the truth even when it was difficult, and to keep believing, together, that kindness offered honestly, without hidden tests or careful arrangements, was worth trusting after all. In the months that followed, their lives wove together with the unremarkable steadiness of any family finding its shape, birthdays celebrated together, school events attended, as a united pair, ordinary Tuesday evenings spent doing homework and making dinner, and negotiating bedtime, all of it built on the foundation they had laid that difficult night on the porch, when honesty, however painful in the moment, had proven itself sturdier than any careful test could ever have shown. Daniel never forgot the lesson those weeks had taught him, that kindness given freely, without expectation of anything returned, had a way of finding its way back around in forms no one could have planned for. And Sarah, in turn, carried forward the quiet, hard-won understanding that trust, once offered honestly and received with patience, no longer needed to be proven again and again, only nurtured, carefully and consistently, for as long as two people chose to keep building something worth protecting together. The following spring, on a bright afternoon that felt almost deliberately kind after a long stretch of gray winter weeks, Daniel and Sarah signed the paperwork on a slightly larger apartment, one with 2 proper bedrooms for the children and a small kitchen big enough for the 4 of them to cook together without constantly bumping elbows. Moving day arrived with the usual chaos of boxes and borrowed trucks, Grace directing traffic from the sidewalk with the brisk efficiency of someone who had clearly done this before, Meg driving in from across town to help carry furniture, and finally meeting Daniel in person after months of hearing about him secondhand. "So you're the famous Daniel," Meg said, setting down a box marked kitchen in the new living room, studying him with open curiosity. "I've heard a great deal about you." "All good things, I hope," Daniel said, offering a hand. "Mostly," Meg said, with a small, knowing smile that told him Sarah had likely shared more of the early complications than he had realized, though nothing in Meg's expression suggested judgment, only the quiet approval of someone who had watched a friend find her way to something steadier than what she had known before. By evening, the apartment stood mostly assembled, boxes still stacked in corners waiting to be unpacked properly over the coming days, but livable enough that the 4 of them gathered on the floor of the new living room for a simple dinner of takeout pizza, celebrating not with any grand toast or ceremony, but with the ordinary satisfaction of a shared meal in a shared home. Lily declared her new room the best room she had ever had, an assessment she had made with equal enthusiasm about every room she had ever occupied, and Noah, now old enough to toddle unsteadily between the scattered boxes, seemed equally delighted simply by the novelty of new spaces to explore. Later, after the children had fallen asleep on a mattress dragged temporarily into the living room because their actual beds had not yet been assembled, Daniel and Sarah stood together at the window of their new kitchen, looking out over a small courtyard lit by the soft glow of street lamps below. "Feels strange," Sarah said quietly, resting her head against his shoulder. "Good strange, like something finally landed instead of just floating." Daniel wrapped an arm around her, watching the quiet courtyard below, thinking of the long road that had brought them to this particular window, this particular evening, a road that had begun with a declined card at a grocery store checkout and wound through weeks of careful, complicated testing before finally settling into the plain, sturdy honesty that now held their lives together. "I used to think the hardest part of loving someone again would be trusting my own judgment," he said. "Turns out the harder part was learning to trust someone else's, even when it took her longer to get there than it took me." Sarah laughed softly, the sound warm in the quiet apartment. "Lucky for me," she said. "You turned out to be exactly patient enough." They stood together a while longer at the window, saying little else, needing little else. 2 people who had learned, in their own separate and difficult ways, that the truest kindness was rarely loud or dramatic, but simply steady, offered again and again without condition, until it became something solid enough to build an entire life upon. Outside, the city settled into its evening quiet, and inside, in a home still half unpacked and entirely theirs, a family that had begun in coincidence and confession, finally rested in the plain, unremarkable peace of belonging fully to one another.